The old woman's hand was ice cold. That was the first thing Yvain noticed. Not the torn hem of the woman's cloak, or the bruise darkening her left temple, or even the fact that she was standing barefoot on a forest path in the middle of autumn with leaves sticking to her skin like wet paper. It was the cold. The kind of cold that should not exist in a living body. Yvain had taken her hand without thinking, the way she always did when someone needed help, and the shock of that unnatural chill had traveled up her arm and settled somewhere behind her ribs like a warning she did not yet understand. Behind her, half a mile back through the trees, the bonding glade was alive with firelight and drumming and the joyful chaos of the autumn gathering. Every unmated wolf in Valdras had traveled there tonight. Every daughter, every son, every hopeful heart looking for the pull, the recognition, the moment when your wolf lifted its head and said, that one is yours." Yvain had not gone. She had planned to. She had even braided wildflowers into her hair that morning, standing in front of the cracked mirror in the room she shared with two other girls at Mistress Arena's healing house. She had told herself this year would be different. This year, someone would notice her. Someone would look past the flower-dusted apron and the herb-stained fingers and the fact that she had no family name, no bloodline, no pack to speak for her, and they would see her. But when evening came and the other girls left in their good dresses with their mothers fussing over their hair, Yvain had stayed behind. Someone had to watch the tinctures cooling on the back shelf. Someone had to check on the Harwell boy whose fever had not broken in 2 days. Someone had to be useful, because if she was not useful, she was nothing. That was the truth she carried like a stone in her chest. Quiet and familiar and so deeply embedded she no longer recognized it as pain. So she had stayed. And when she stepped outside to empty a basin of water and heard the thin, reedy sound of someone calling for help from the tree line, she had gone without hesitation. Now here she was, holding a stranger's frozen hand on a dark forest path, the sounds of the gathering fading behind her. And something about this moment felt like standing on the edge of a cliff she could not see. The woman was small, frail in a way that tugged at something protective in Yvain's chest. Her silver hair hung loose around a face that might have been beautiful once, all sharp cheekbones and clever eyes, though now those eyes were clouded with confusion and what looked like genuine fear. "Where am I?" the woman asked, her voice thin and trembling. "I was walking. I was going somewhere, and then the path changed, and I cannot remember." "You are near Brackenvale," Yvain said gently, steadying her with both hands now. "About a mile south of the village. Do you have people nearby? Someone I can send for?" The woman shook her head slowly. "I cannot remember." Yvain's healer instincts sharpened. Confusion, memory loss, a bruise on the temple, bare feet on rough ground. This woman had either fallen or been struck, and she had been wandering long enough to lose her shoes and most of the warmth in her extremities. "All right," Yvain said, keeping her voice calm and steady, the voice Mistress Arena had taught her to use with frightened patience. "You are safe now. My name is Yvain, and I am going to take you somewhere warm. Can you walk?" "I think so," the woman said. She took one step and her knees buckled. Yvain caught her, wrapping one arm around the woman's narrow waist. She weighed almost nothing. Her bones felt like kindling beneath the threadbare cloak. "Lean on me," Yvain said. "I have you." They moved slowly through the dark woods, Yvain half carrying the woman, stepping carefully over roots and stones. The sounds of the bonding glade grew fainter with every step, until all Yvain could hear was the rustle of leaves, the woman's shallow breathing, and the distant mournful cry of a wolf somewhere in the hills. It took nearly 30 minutes to reach the healing house. By the time Yvain shouldered open the door and guided the woman inside, her own arms were shaking from the effort. She settled the woman into the cot nearest the fire and pulled a wool blanket up to her chin. Then she moved quickly, stoking the fire until it roared, heating water, preparing a compress for the bruise, and brewing a tea of ginger root and dried elderflower to chase the cold from the woman's blood. "Drink this," Yvain murmured, lifting the cup to the woman's lips. Slowly. The woman sipped. Some color returned to her cheeks. Her eyes cleared slightly, and she looked up at Yvain with an expression that was almost startled, as if she had not expected kindness. "You left the gathering," the woman said. "I can hear the drums from here. You should be there, not tending to me." Yvain smiled and tucked the blanket tighter. "The gathering will happen again next year. You needed help now." "But the bonding," the woman pressed, studying Yvain's face with an intensity that seemed out of place for someone who had been half dead with cold 5 minutes ago. "Every young wolf dreams of finding their mate at the autumn gathering. You gave that up to help a stranger?" Something twisted behind Yvain's ribs. She looked away, busying herself with rinsing the basin. "I am not the kind of girl wolves dream about," she said quietly, and she meant it to sound light, even funny, but it came out raw and honest in a way she had not intended. The woman was quiet for a long moment. "What is your name again, child?" she asked. "Yvain?" "Yvain," the woman repeated, and something shifted in her voice, something warm and deliberate and almost fierce. "I think you might be exactly the kind of girl wolves dream about. They just have not been paying attention." Yvain laughed softly, dismissing the words the way she always dismissed kindness aimed at her, like a stray dog flinching from an open hand. She checked the compress, adjusted the fire, and settled into the chair beside the cot. The woman's eyes drifted shut, and her breathing deepened into sleep. Yvain sat in the quiet, the drums of the bonding glade still faintly pulsing through the walls, and told herself she had made the right choice. Helping was always the right choice. It had to be, because if helping was not enough to make her matter, then nothing was. She did not know that the woman sleeping in her cot was not lost at all. She did not know that the bruise on her temple and the confusion in her eyes were real, but the circumstances that had brought her to that forest path were far more complicated than a simple fall. And she did not know that by morning, the most powerful wolf in the kingdom would be standing in her doorway, and nothing about her small, invisible life would ever be the same. Chapter 1. The pounding on the door came before dawn. Yvain jolted awake in the chair beside the cot, her neck stiff, her hand still resting on the compress she had been replacing through the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was cold and gray, with the first thin light of morning. The pounding came again. Not a knock, a demand. Yvain stood, her heart lurching, and crossed to the door. When she opened it, the morning air hit her face like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the sight that greeted her. A man filled the doorway. Filled it the way a storm fills a valley, not just occupying the space but commanding it, pressing against its edges, making it feel too small to contain him. He was tall in a way that forced Yvain to tilt her head back, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair cut close and eyes the color of a winter sky just before the first snow. Those eyes locked onto hers, and Yvain felt the impact like a physical blow, a pressure that started in her chest and radiated outward until her fingers tingled. Behind him stood 6 armed wolves in palace armor, the crest of the Ashenmere bloodline stamped into every breastplate. "Where is she?" the man asked. His voice was low and controlled, but something savage lurked beneath the surface, coiled and barely restrained. Yvain opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because she knew who this was. Every wolf in Valdras knew. Kale Ashenmere, the Alpha King, the man who had united 3 warring territories through diplomacy where it worked and sheer devastating force where it did not. The man whose wolf form, according to the stories, was the size of a warhorse and twice as terrifying. The man who ruled Valdras with an iron will and a reputation for being utterly, mercilessly fair. He was looking at her like she was an obstacle between him and something precious, and the weight of that look made her knees want to buckle. "The woman," he said again, his jaw tight, silver hair, small. She would have been confused, possibly injured. She went missing from her escort last night. She is inside. She is safe. Something cracked in his expression. Not softness exactly, but the sudden release of a tension so profound that for one unguarded second, Yvain saw the fear that had been living behind those cold eyes. He pushed past her without waiting for permission, his shoulder brushing hers as he moved through the narrow doorway. The contact sent a jolt through her body that she did not have time to process because he was already across the room, already kneeling beside the cot, already taking the woman's hand in both of his. "Mother," he said, and his voice broke on the word. Mother. The woman she had found barefoot and freezing on a forest path. The woman she had carried through the dark and tucked into a borrowed cot and fed ginger tea was the Alpha King's mother. The woman stirred. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found her son's face. "Kale," she said, and smiled. "I found the most wonderful girl." The king's head dropped forward. His shoulders shook once, just once, and then he composed himself with the rigid discipline of someone who considered vulnerability a debt he could not afford. "You left your escort," he said quietly. "You walked into the forest alone, in the dark, without shoes." "The shoes were pinching," she replied, "and the escort was too slow." Yvain watched from the doorway, acutely aware that she was witnessing something private, something she had no right to see. The most feared alpha in the realm, kneeling beside a cot in a healer's back room, holding his mother's hand like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. The contrast between the man who had filled the doorway with barely controlled fury and the man who now cradled his mother's fingers as if they were made of glass was so stark it made Yvain's throat tighten. Torven, the king's beta, appeared at Yvain's shoulder. She had not heard him approach, which was alarming for a man his size. He was nearly as tall as the king, but leaner, with watchful amber eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. "How long has she been here?" Torven asked, his voice pitched low. "Since last night," Yvain whispered. "I found her on the south path, near the bonding glade. She was confused and cold, with a bruise on her left temple. I treated her for exposure and monitored her through the night." Torven studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. "You found the king's mother wandering alone in the woods, and instead of alerting anyone, you brought her here and treated her yourself?" "I did not know who she was," Yvain said. "I just saw someone who needed help." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the faint loosening of judgment that comes when someone exceeds your expectations. "Stay here," he said. "The king will want to speak with you." He moved to the king's side and they spoke in voices too low for Yvain to hear. She watched Kale's head turn, watched his gaze find her across the room. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Something electric and unnamed and terrifying. Then his expression closed like a door slamming shut, and he turned back to his mother. Yvain's wolf, dormant and disinterested her entire life, stirred. The sensation was so unfamiliar, so startling, that she pressed her hand flat against her sternum as if she could push it back down. She had felt nothing at 13 gatherings, nothing at 13 bonding fires. Her wolf had slept through every one of them without so much as a flicker of interest, and Yvain had long since accepted that she was simply not the kind of wolf who found her mate. Some wolves did not. It was rare and lonely, but it happened. And now it was awake, alert, straining toward the man across the room with a pull so fierce it stole her breath. "No," Yvain told herself firmly, "absolutely not." But the pull did not listen. Chapter 2. The king's party did not leave. Yvain had expected them to bundle Matilda into a carriage and vanish back to the capital within the hour. Instead, Cale sent 3 of his guards to ride ahead with a message while he remained at the healing house, sitting beside his mother's cot with the steady vigilance of someone who appeared to have nowhere else to be. This was clearly untrue. He was the king. He had everywhere to be. Mistress Arena arrived at sunrise, took one look at the armed wolves stationed around her front door, and walked inside without breaking stride. She assessed Matilda with brisk efficiency, checked Yvain's work, and gave a curt nod that was the highest compliment she ever offered. Mild concussion, moderate exposure. She will be fine with rest and monitoring, Arena pronounced, directing this at the king as if he were any other worried relative in her examination room. I would not recommend travel today, possibly not tomorrow either. Cale's jaw tightened. How long? 2 days, perhaps 3. That is not acceptable. Then it is not acceptable, Arena replied, unmoved. But she is not leaving this cot until I say so. Yvain will attend to her, Arena continued, gesturing toward the doorway where Yvain stood frozen. She treated her through the night and knows the case. And that was how Yvain became the personal attendant to the Alpha King's mother, while the Alpha King himself sat 6 feet away, reading reports his beta brought by the hour and radiating a tension so thick the air felt permanently charged. Caring for Matilda, as she insisted Yvain call her, was the easiest assignment she had ever had. The woman was warm, sharp-witted, and endlessly curious. She asked about every herb on the shelf, every tincture, every dried flower hanging from the ceiling beams. And this one? Matilda asked, holding up a sprig of dried silver vine. For headaches, Yvain said, replacing the compress on Matilda's temple. And mild pain. It also helps with sleep, if you brew it strong enough. Does it work on kings? Matilda asked, her eyes sliding pointedly toward her son. Yvain bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. Cale sat at the small table across the room, his pen scratching across parchment with the controlled aggression of someone who would rather be doing literally anything other than sitting still. I do not believe anything calms kings, Yvain said carefully. Matilda laughed. It was a warm sound, cracked at the edges but genuine, and something loosened inside Yvain at the hearing of it. She was beginning to understand why the king had torn across the countryside to find this woman. Matilda was not just his mother. She was the only person in his life who treated him like a human being instead of a throne. The problem was not Matilda. The problem was Cale. Every time Yvain moved through the room, she felt his attention track her, not watching exactly. More like awareness, a gravitational pull that turned his head 2 degrees when she passed, that made his pen pause mid-word when she spoke. That sharpened the quality of silence in his direction when she laughed at something his mother said. He never addressed her directly. Not once. The deliberateness of that avoidance felt louder than conversation. Her wolf disagreed with the silence. It pressed against the inside of her skin whenever the king was close, leaning toward him with a hunger that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with something Yvain refused to name. On the second morning, Yvain was changing the dressing on Matilda's temple when the woman caught her wrist. You feel it, Matilda said quietly. Not a question. The pull. Toward my son. You feel it, and you are pretending you do not. Yvain's face burned. She opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came. I am nobody, she whispered instead. I have no family, no pack, no name that means anything to anyone. Whatever I feel does not matter because it cannot go anywhere. Matilda's grip tightened. I was nobody once too. Before I was the king's mother. Before the crown and the politics. I was a tanner's daughter from a village smaller than this one, and the old king's advisor spent 3 years trying to convince him I was not enough. She paused. He said, the wolf does not choose by bloodline. The wolf chooses by soul. The words landed somewhere deep and stayed there, glowing like an ember Yvain was afraid to breathe on. A sound from across the room. Cale had appeared in the doorway, his hand braced against the frame, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent her pulse scattering. He had heard. She could see it in the rigid line of his jaw, in the way his fingers whitened against the doorframe. Their eyes locked. 1 second, 2. Then he turned and walked away without a word. That night, Yvain lay in her narrow bed in the room upstairs, staring at the ceiling, and tried to suffocate the hope that was building in her chest like a vine growing through the cracks in a stone wall. It did not work. And downstairs, Torvin leaned against the doorframe of the small room where the king sat alone by the dying fire. "You know what she is," Torvin said quietly. Cale did not answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and raw with something that sounded like grief. "She deserves better than this," he said. "That is not your decision to make," the beta replied. The fire cracked. The silence stretched. And somewhere in the dark, a bond that neither of them had chosen continued to pull. Chapter 3. Matilda recovered faster than expected. By the third morning she was sitting up, color restored, arguing with Irina about whether she was well enough to walk in the garden. She won, because Matilda won every argument, and Yvain found herself guiding her through the small herb garden behind the healing house, one arm linked through hers, the autumn sun warm on their faces. Cale followed at a distance. Always at a distance. "He is watching you again," Matilda murmured, patting Yvain's arm. "He is watching you," Yvain corrected, "making sure you do not fall." "Child, I have been walking for 67 years. He is not watching me." Matilda stopped beside a patch of wild thyme. "Tell me about your parents," she said, the shift so casual it almost masked the weight of the question. Yvain stiffened. "There is not much to tell. I was left at the gate of this village when I was a few days old. No note, no name, no explanation. Mistress Irina took me in because no one else would." "And you have been earning your place ever since," Matilda said, not unkindly. "Every task, every patient, every late night. You have been trying to prove that you deserve to exist. That if you are useful enough, it will make up for the fact that someone left you behind." Yvain stopped walking. Her eyes burned. She did not cry. Not here. Not with the king standing 30 paces behind them, but the tears were close, pressing with a force that made her jaw ache. "I am not saying this to hurt you," Matilda said softly. "I am saying this because my son does the same thing. He carries the weight of every decision, every loss, every life trusted to his care. He believes that if he works hard enough, sacrifices enough, he can earn the right to the crown he inherited, as if worthiness is a debt that can never be fully paid." Yvain looked over her shoulder at Kael. He stood motionless on the garden path, a silhouette against the morning light. Even from this distance she could see the loneliness of a man surrounded by people but known by none of them. Something in her ached for him. Not the pull of the bond, though that was there too, constant and maddening. Something quieter and older. The simple recognition of a wound she shared reflected back to her in the rigid posture and untouchable silence of a man who carried everything and held nothing. "You are alike," Matilda said. "Both of you earning what should simply be given." The fourth day came, and Matilda was cleared to travel. Irina announced it at breakfast with her usual bluntness, and the words landed in Yvain's stomach like cold water. She helped Matilda dress for the journey, fastening the clasps of a traveling cloak finer than anything she had ever touched. The fabric was soft enough to make her fingertips ache with awareness of the distance between this world and her own. Her fingers trembled on the last clasp as she realized with a sickening lurch that this was ending. The king's party would leave. Matilda would return to the capital, and Yvain would go back to her narrow bed and her invisible life, and the brief, agonizing window in which the world had felt larger would close forever. She would not cry. She had decided that much. "Thank you," Yvain said, her voice steady despite the fissure opening inside her. "For being kind to me." Matilda took her hands. "You gave me warmth when I was cold, and kindness when I was frightened, and your own bed when you had nothing else to offer. That is not small. Do not make it small." The carriage was waiting in front of the healing house. The guards had mounted. Everything was ready. Cale stood on the path between the carriage and the front door, his back to Yvain, speaking in low tones with his beta. She watched him from the doorway and memorized the breadth of his shoulders, the way the morning light caught in his dark hair, the sound of his voice, even though she could not make out the words. She was memorizing him the way you memorize something you know you are about to lose. Matilda climbed into the carriage with Torvin's help. The door began to close. "Wait," Cale said. Everyone stopped. The guards, the beta, the horses themselves seemed to still. Cale turned and looked directly at Yvain. His expression was controlled, but something burned behind his eyes, something desperate and barely contained. "The court healer's position," he said, his voice carrying with a precision that suggested he had rehearsed this. "In the capital, it has been vacant for 6 months. We need someone competent, trustworthy. My mother speaks highly of your skills. The position includes quarters in the palace, a full dispensary, and access to the Royal Medical Library." Yvain stared at him. Her mind went blank. Behind the carriage window, Matilda's face appeared, wearing an expression of profound, triumphant satisfaction. "Your Majesty," Yvain managed, "I am just an apprentice from a village no one has heard of. I am not qualified to serve as court healer." "My mother disagrees," he said, "and she has never been wrong about people." Yvain looked at Irina, who lingered behind her with her arms crossed. The old healer met her gaze and gave the smallest, most imperceptible nod. "Yes," Yvain said, the word escaping before her fear could catch it. "I will come." Something flickered across Cale's face. Relief, hunger, terror, all compressed into a single instant before the mask returned. "Gather your things. We leave within the hour." He turned on his heel and strode toward the carriage, and Yvain stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known, trembling from head to foot, and realized that she had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. Chapter 4. The capital was nothing like Brackenvale. The city of Valdras sprawled across the valley like a living thing, stone and iron and glass gleaming in the afternoon light. And the palace at its center rose from the landscape like a mountain someone had carved into a fortress. Her new quarters were beautiful. A sitting room with actual cushioned chairs. A bedroom with a mattress so thick she could press her hand into it and watch the fabric swallow her fingers. And beyond the sitting room, through a heavy oak door, her dispensary. Shelves lined every wall, already stocked with more herbs and tinctures and instruments than Irina's entire healing house combined. It was more than Yvain had ever owned, ever touched, ever dreamed of possessing. And it felt like wearing someone else's clothes. She did not see the king for 3 days. His absence pressed against her awareness like a bruise she kept bumping. Her wolf tracked his location the way a compass needle tracks north. She could not explain how she knew he was in the East Wing during the mornings, or that he took his meals alone in his study, or that he did not sleep well. She simply knew, the way you know which direction the wind is blowing without looking at the trees. She threw herself into work instead. The palace healers, a soft-spoken man named Fennet, and a sharp-eyed woman named Lisara, received her with polite skepticism. A village apprentice appointed to court healer. They did not say it aloud, but Yvain could read the doubt in their careful silences. She won Fennet over on the second day, when she identified a fungal infection in a guardsman's wound that he had misdiagnosed as simple inflammation. Lisara took longer, but by the end of the first week, When Yvain stayed up through the night to reformulate a fever draft that the palace had been preparing incorrectly for years, the woman's skepticism thawed into grudging respect. But the work, satisfying as it was, could not drown out the pull. It was growing. She found herself pausing in corridors when his scent drifted through, turning her head toward closed doors she had no reason to approach, waking in the middle of the night with her hand pressed against her ribs. On the fourth day, Torven appeared in her dispensary. "Matilda has requested your company for afternoon tea." She found Matilda in a sunlit parlor, looking fully recovered and entirely too pleased with herself. "Sit," Matilda commanded warmly. "You look thin. Are you eating?" "I am eating." "You are lying. Eat a cake." Yvain ate a cake. It was extraordinary. She ate a second one before she could stop herself, and Matilda watched with open satisfaction. "Now," Matilda said, pouring tea, "tell me everything." Yvain talked. She had not realized how desperately she needed to until the words started coming. She told Matilda about the dispensary, the palace healers, the corridors that all looked the same, and the servants who stared, and the noble women who whispered behind their fans when she passed. "They think I do not belong here," Yvain said, wrapping both hands around her teacup. "And they are not wrong. They are entirely wrong, but that is not what is really bothering you, is it?" Yvain looked down at her tea. "He has not spoken to me. Not once since we arrived. I see him in the corridors sometimes, and he looks through me like I am made of glass." Matilda set her cup down. "My son is an extraordinarily intelligent man who becomes spectacularly stupid when he is afraid. He fears that if he acknowledges the bond, the court will devour you, that the weight of his crown will crush something in you he cannot bear to see broken. So he ignores me instead." The words came out smaller than she wanted them to. "He thinks he is protecting you," Matilda replied. "He is, of course, an idiot." Despite everything, Yvain laughed. The sound surprised her, bright and raw and aching at the edges. "Give him time," Matilda said, "but not too much." That evening, Yvain was returning to her quarters through the east corridor when she rounded a corner and stopped. Kyle stood at the far end of the hall, alone, silhouetted against the tall windows where the last light of day bled through in shades of copper and amber. He had not seen her. His head was bowed, one hand braced against the window frame, and there was something in his posture that made her breath catch. He looked exhausted. Not ordinary tiredness, but something deeper, something that had settled into his bones and taken root. She should have turned around. Instead, she walked toward him. He heard her. His body went rigid. And when he turned to face her, the look in his eyes was so raw, so unguarded, that the bond flared in her chest like a struck match. "Your Majesty," she said, stopping a few paces away, close enough to see the tight set of his mouth, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "You look terrible." The words were out before she could stop them. She winced. That came out wrong. "You look tired. Very tired. And I am a healer, so I notice these things." Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the armor through which something warm and startled leaked out. "You cannot help with this," he said quietly. "You do not know that." They stood in the fading light, close enough that she could smell him. Pine and wood smoke, and something underneath that was purely him, and her wolf pressed so hard against her skin she was certain he could feel it. "When did you last sleep through the night?" she asked. He did not answer. "Your Majesty." "Kale," he said, and the word came out rough, almost involuntary. "When we are alone, just Kale." Her heart hammered. "Kale, when did you last sleep?" He looked away. "I cannot remember." She recognized it. Not just the exhaustion, but the particular brand of stubborn, self-destroying pride that refused to ask for help because asking meant admitting weakness, and admitting weakness meant becoming a burden. She knew it because she carried the same wound. "Good night, Yvain," he said. And he walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor until the silence swallowed them whole. Yvain stood alone in the dying light. Something was wrong with the king, something beyond exhaustion, beyond the weight of the crown. And whatever it was getting worse. Chapter 5. She discovered the truth by accident. 3 weeks into her position at the palace, Yvain was conducting nightly rounds through the lower ward, checking on a guard who had taken an arrow through the shoulder during a border skirmish, when she heard the screaming. It was faint, muffled by stone walls and distance. But Yvain had spent her life in a healing house, and she knew the sound of someone in agony the way other people knew birdsong. It was unmistakable. She followed it through corridors she had not yet explored, past the council wing, past the royal apartments, until she reached a heavy door flanked by 2 guards who looked deeply uncomfortable. "What is happening in there?" Yvain demanded. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with, healer." Another scream, low, guttural, torn from a throat that was trying desperately to stay silent. The sound vibrated through the door and into Yvain's body, and her wolf surged forward with such violence that she staggered, because she knew that voice. "Open this door or I will open it myself, and you will have to explain to the king's beta why you laid hands on the court healer." She did not wait. She pushed past them, shoved the door open, and froze. The room was dark. Furniture had been overturned. A chair splintered against the far wall, a table lying on its side with papers scattered like fallen leaves. And in the center of the destruction, on his knees, was Kale. He was shirtless. His skin gleamed with sweat in the dim light, and she could see the muscles in his back and shoulders contracting, locked in some kind of spasm. His hands were pressed flat against the stone floor, fingers splayed, claws half extended in a partial shift that should not have been possible. Wolves shifted fully or not at all. This between state meant his wolf was trying to tear free of his body, and his body was refusing to let it. "Get out!" Kale growled without looking up. His voice was barely human. Yvain did not move. "Get out," he said again, and this time the snarl beneath the words rattled the glass in the windows. Yvain knelt. She lowered herself to the floor slowly, deliberately, the way Arena had taught her to approach a wounded animal, making herself small, non-threatening, present. She was terrified. Her hands were shaking and her heart was slamming against her ribs. But her wolf was calm, calmer than it had ever been, and it pressed forward with an absolute certainty that overrode every rational thought in her head. "Kale," she said softly, "look at me." His head lifted. His eyes were wrong, not the winter sky gray she knew, but something luminous and fractured, the wolf and the man fighting for control behind his irises. His lips pulled back from teeth that were too long, too sharp. "What is happening to you?" she whispered. He shook his head. "It passes. It always passes. Just leave." "How often?" He did not answer. "How often, Kyle?" "Every night." Her blood went cold. Every night. She thought of the exhaustion carved into his face, the way he carried himself like a man held together by willpower alone. This was not insomnia. His wolf was at war with his body, and it was tearing him apart from the inside. "I am going to touch you," she said. "Do not bite me." A sound escaped him, something too broken and bitter to be called a laugh, but too close to deny. "I cannot promise that." She reached out anyway. Her hand found his shoulder, and the moment her skin met his, 2 things happened simultaneously. His wolf recoiled. She felt the savage, clawing presence that had been shredding him from within suddenly flinch backward. The tension in his muscles released so abruptly that he nearly collapsed forward. And the bond ignited. Not the quiet pull she had been feeling for weeks. A wildfire. A roar. A tidal wave of sensation that crashed through her body and left her gasping, and she felt his shock mirror hers through a connection that was suddenly, overwhelmingly real. "What did you do?" he breathed, his eyes wide, his face inches from hers. "I have no idea," she said honestly. He was staring at her like she had just rewritten the laws of the world. His eyes were his own again, gray and clear, and the claws had retracted, and beneath her hand his skin was warm instead of burning. Torvin appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, and closed the door behind him. "The episode started 6 months ago," Torvin said, addressing Yvain now. "Mild at first. A tremor. A partial shift. Now they last hours. The court physicians have no explanation." "Why did no one tell me?" Yvain asked. "I am the court healer. This is exactly what I am here to treat." "Because the king forbade it," Torvin said carefully. Yvain looked down at Kale, who had the decency to look guilty. "You brought me here," she said, anger rising beneath the shock and the overwhelming residual hum of the bond. "You gave me a title and a dispensary, and you did not tell me that the person most in need of healing was you. I brought you here because my mother nearly died in the cold and you saved her life with ginger tea and a blanket. I did not bring you here for this." "Then why can I stop it?" The silence that followed was deafening. Kale looked at Torvin. Torvin looked at Kale. Something passed between them, a wordless conversation built on years of trust. "There is a theory," Torvin said slowly, "that the episodes are not an illness. They are a symptom of an incomplete bond. His wolf is searching for its mate, and the longer the bond goes unacknowledged, the more violent the search becomes." Yvain stared at Kale. He would not meet her eyes. "You knew," she said. "You knew the bond was making you sick, and you chose to suffer rather than tell me." "I chose to protect you," he said roughly. "From me, from the crown, from a life you did not choose, and cannot walk away from once it begins." Yvain pulled her hand free and stood. Her eyes burned. She could feel his pain through the bond, his fear, his desperate, misguided love that had turned itself into a weapon pointed at both of them. "You do not get to make that choice for me," she said, her voice cracking. "You do not get to decide what I can survive." She turned and walked out of the room, past Torvin, past the guards, into the dark corridor where no one could see the tears on her face. Behind her, she heard Kale's voice, wrecked and raw. "Let her go. She deserves the chance to leave." And Torvin, breaking a habit forged over years of unquestioning loyalty, disobeyed. He followed her. Chapter 6. Yvain made it to the herb garden before her legs gave out. She sank onto the stone bench beneath the arbor, the night air cold on her wet face, and pressed both hands against her chest as if she could physically hold herself together. The bond pulsed behind her ribs, radiating warmth and longing and the ghost of Kale's pain that she could still feel through the connection like an echo in a cave. Footsteps on the gravel path. Torvin sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them, and said nothing for a long time. He did not try to comfort her, or explain, or justify. He simply sat with her in the dark, two people who understood that some pain required company more than words. "How long does he have?" Yvain asked finally, her voice raw. "The physicians estimate 3 months, perhaps 4, if the episodes do not intensify. But they are intensifying." "And if the bond is completed?" "The episodes stop. The wolf settles. He lives." "He would rather die than bind me to him against my will," Yvain said. Not a question. "Yes," Torvin said simply. "That is the most infuriating thing I have ever heard." "I agree." Yvain wiped her face with the back of her hand. "He thinks he is unworthy of me. That is what this is. It is the same wound we both carry. He cannot fathom that someone would choose him willingly. That the bond is not a burden he is placing on me but something I might actually want. Torvin regarded her with an expression she had not seen before. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. You understand him better than anyone alive, the beta said quietly. Including me? Yvain stood. Her legs were steadier now, and something had shifted inside her. The fear was still there, the uncertainty. But beneath it all, solid as stone, was the certainty that she was not going to let him die because he was too proud and too broken to ask for what he needed. I am not leaving, Yvain said. She did not go to Kale that night. She went to Matilda. Matilda opened her chamber door in a dressing gown, took one look at Yvain's tear-streaked face, and pulled her inside without a word. She sat Yvain in a chair by the fire, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and pressed a cup of warm wine into her hands. Yvain told her everything, the episodes, the partial shifts, the theory about the incomplete bond, his willingness to die. My son inherited his father's stubbornness, Matilda said, and his grandmother's talent for suffering in silence. A spectacular combination. What do I do? Yvain whispered. What do you want to do? I want to save him. And beyond that? I want him. Not because of the bond, not because saving him gives me a purpose. I want him because when he said my name in the corridor that night, just my name, it felt like the first time anyone had ever really seen me. Matilda set down her wine. Her eyes were bright, fierce, glittering with tears she was too proud to shed. Then you do not need my permission, but you have it, and you have my love, and if my son gives you any trouble, you send him to me. Yvain found him at dawn. He was in the council chamber, alone, sitting at the long table with his head in his hands. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. His skin had a grayish cast that made her healer's instincts scream. His hands trembled with a fine, constant vibration. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shattered. I told you to go, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had spent the night preparing to lose the only thing that mattered. And I am telling you no, Yvain replied, crossing the room with steady steps. I am not leaving. Not because of duty, not because of your mother, not because the bond compels me, but because I choose this. I choose you. You do not know what that means. The court will tear you apart. You have no name, no family, no protection. I have survived 23 years without a name or a family or a single person in the world who was required to care whether I lived or died. Do not tell me what I cannot survive. He stared up at her. This enormous, powerful man who ruled a kingdom and could not rule his own heart, and something in his expression crumbled. I am dying, Yvain, he whispered. I know. That is why I am here. She reached out and placed her hand on his cheek, and the bond surged between them like a river breaking through a dam. She felt his wolf settle, felt the trembling in his hands go still, felt the agony of weeks ease into something warm and steady and whole. His eyes closed. He turned his face into her palm and breathed her in, a long, shuddering inhale that seemed to pull him back from whatever edge he had been standing on. Stay, he said. Not a command, a plea. I already told you, I am not going anywhere. He pulled her down into his arms, and she went willingly, folding against his chest like she had been shaped to fit there. His arms wrapped around her, tight and desperate and trembling, and she felt his face press into her hair, felt the wetness on her scalp, and she held him tighter. They stayed like that as the sun rose through the tall windows, painting the council chamber in shades of gold, and for the first time since she had known him, Kale Ashenmere was still. But outside those walls, in the corridors and parlors where power lived and bred, a woman named Sithara Voss watched the sunrise with cold calculation. She had been promised to the king, An arrangement between noble houses, political and strategic, sealed before the foundling healer had ever set foot in the palace. And Sithara did not lose what was hers. Not to anyone, and certainly not to a nameless girl who smelled of herbs and had the audacity to touch what did not belong to her. Chapter 7. Sithara moved quickly. Within 2 days, the whispers had turned into a roar. The court hummed with outrage, carefully stoked and strategically directed. A foundling with no bloodline, chosen over a daughter of the Voss house. It was an insult to every noble family in Valdros, and Sithara made certain they felt it. Yvain heard the rumors through the walls, that she had bewitched the king with herbs, that she had seduced him during his episodes, taking advantage of his weakened state, that she was barren, cursed, unworthy. Each accusation landed like a stone thrown at glass. She did not break, but she cracked. Kale noticed. The bond made it impossible not to. "I will address the court and make the position clear," he told her, pacing the length of his study. "And say what? That the king commands them to accept me? You cannot force respect, Kyle. You can only earn it. You should not have to earn the right to exist in your own home." The word stopped her cold. Your own home. He had said it without thinking. The way you say things that are so deeply true they bypass the brain entirely and come straight from the marrow. "Sithara will petition the council," Torven informed them that evening, his expression grim. "She intends to invoke the old law, contested claim of mate. If the council rules in her favor, the bond cannot be completed without unanimous consent from the noble houses." "That law has not been invoked in 200 years, Kale said dangerously. "She is not trying to win the petition," Torven replied. "She is trying to delay. Every day the bond remains incomplete, you get worse." Yvain had seen the episodes growing more violent. 2 nights ago, his eyes had been fully wolf for nearly a minute before her touch brought him back. His control was eroding. Sithara knew. She was counting on it. "There is another way," Yvain said quietly. Both men turned to her. "The old law requires a contested claimant to demonstrate a prior bond. If Sithara has no bond with Kyle, the petition is invalid." Torven's eyebrows rose. "You have been reading the legal texts." "I have been reading everything. When I do not know what to do, I work." The hearing was set for 3 days later. Yvain spent those days in the medical library, reading everything she could find about wolf bonds, mate recognition, and the old laws governing contested claims. Matilda brought her food and sat with her in silence, and once, in the small hours, reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You are not fighting for the right to be queen," Matilda said. "You are fighting for the right to be seen." The hearing convened in the Great Hall. Yvain had never stood before so many people in her life. The council members sat in a curved row on a raised platform. The noble houses filled the gallery behind them. Sithara stood on the opposite side of the chamber in a gown of deep emerald, her chin high, her composure flawless. Kale sat in the king's chair on the raised dais, his hands flat on the armrests, every line of his body rigid with restraint. He was not permitted to speak during a contested claim hearing. The law required his silence while others decided his fate. Yvain could feel his fear through the bond, could feel how desperately he wanted to stand and end this by force, and could feel the iron restraint it took him to remain seated. Sithara spoke first, eloquent, persuasive, and ruthless. She spoke of duty, of bloodlines, of the stability that a proper mating would bring to the realm, political alliances and the expectations of the noble houses, the danger of allowing a king to choose sentiment over strategy. She never once mentioned love. When it was Yvain's turn, she stood on trembling legs and looked out at a room full of people who believed she was nothing. "I have no bloodline to offer," she said, and her voice shook on the first word but steadied by the third. "No family name, no political alliance, no dowry, no title. I have nothing that this court values. She paused. The silence was absolute. But I have this. She turned to face Sithara directly. The old law requires a contested claimant to demonstrate a prior bond. Lady Voss, you have spoken of duty and strategy and alliance, but a mate bond is not a contract. It is not negotiated. It cannot be manufactured or performed or willed into existence. She looked at Cale. His eyes were locked on hers, and through the bond she felt everything. His terror and his pride and his love laid bare and blazing. The bond chose, Yvain said, her voice ringing through the hall. Not me, not the king, the bond itself. And if this court believes that politics should override the will of the wolf, then I ask you to consider what kind of kingdom you are building. One where wolves are free, or one where even the deepest part of who we are can be overruled by those with louder voices and finer clothes? The vote was called. 7-4, the council ruled the contested claim invalid. The petition was dismissed. In the aftermath, Cale descended from the platform and crossed the floor to where Yvain stood. The entire court was watching. Every noble, every servant, every guard. He took her hand, raised it to his lips, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that was so tender, so deliberate, so unmistakably public that it said more than any declaration ever could. Thank you, he murmured against her skin, for choosing me. That night, in the privacy of his chambers, with the fire burning low and the palace finally quiet, Yvain placed her hand over Cale's heart and felt the bond complete itself. Not with ceremony, not with spectacle. Just two people who had spent their lives earning the right to exist, finally allowing themselves to simply be. His wolf settled. The trembling stopped. And when he fell asleep with her pressed against his chest, his breathing deep, and even for the first time in months, Yvain lay awake in the dark and let the tears come. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming, terrifying, extraordinary relief of being home. Epilogue. The episodes did not vanish overnight. Healing, real healing, was slow and stubborn and refused to follow a straight line. Some nights were peaceful. Others, Cale woke gasping, his wolf surging beneath his skin, and Yvain was there. She was always there. Her hand on his chest, her voice in the dark, steady and sure. The court adjusted. Not gracefully and not all at once, but Yvain's skill as a healer won allies that her title as the king's mate could not. She treated a councilman's daughter through a fever that 3 physicians had failed to break. She reorganized the palace dispensary. She trained Fenna and Lysara in techniques Arena had perfected over decades. Sithara Voss left the capital without farewell. Matilda, predictably, was insufferable about the whole thing. She told anyone who would listen that she had known from the moment Yvain took her hand on that dark forest path. I was not actually lost, Matilda confessed one afternoon over tea, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Yvain stared at her. What do you mean you were not lost? I may have wandered from the escort on purpose, to see who would come. The concussion was an unfortunate encounter with a tree root I did not anticipate, but the wandering was entirely intentional. Yvain opened her mouth, closed it, and laughed until her ribs ached. Months later, on a morning so ordinary it felt sacred, Yvain woke to pale light and the sound of steady breathing beside her. Cale was still asleep. His face was peaceful. One hand rested on her hip, warm and certain, holding her even in dreams. She watched him for a moment. This man who had been tearing himself apart when she found him. This king who had been so afraid of burdening her that he had nearly died rather than ask for help. He was not fixed. Neither was she. But they were whole. Yvain closed her eyes, settled against his chest, and slept. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.